Welcome everyone. My name is Michael Willis. I'm the director of the Middle East Centre here at St Antony's College at the University of Oxford. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Middle East Centre webinar series. This is a new series of events that we will be running occasionally to address significant issues that have arisen recently in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, the main purpose of these seminars is to provide a platform for experts on these issues to discuss and explain what is happening in the region on a particular issue and to help put developments in some wider context. Our first webinar of the year focuses on Tunisia and looks at events that have occurred in the country over the last 4 months, particularly since July the 25th. That was when President Kais Saied announced he was dismissing the government, suspending the national parliament, and lifting the immunity from prosecution for members of parliament. Now, this move was welcomed by many in Tunisia as a much-needed shake-up of a system that had become corrupt and inefficient, and which had signally failed to deal with both the COVID pandemic and Tunisia's deep economic problems. On the other hand, there were others in Tunisia who saw the move as a dangerous power grab by the president that threatened to uproot the democratic system that had been put in place in the aftermath of a popular uprising but against President Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali in January 2011, and thus in this way possibly heralding the end of the one democracy that had been put in place as a result of the uprisings of what became known as the Arab Spring of that year. Now, nearly 4 months on, this debate continues. And to help explain and understand what has happened, we have invited two of the most prominent commentators and analysts of Tunisian political affairs to discuss this issue. Our first speaker will be Youssef Cherif. Youssef is a Tunis-based political analyst and runs the Columbia Global Centers in Tunis, the North and West African Research Center of Columbia University in the States. He is a member of Carnegie's Civic Activism Network and has worked at a number of leading research centers and think tanks, producing papers and commenting in the media. You regularly see Youssef commenting across media in English, French, and Arabic. Youssef was also the editor of the book, The Modern Arab State, A Decade of Uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, which came out just this year. Our second speaker is Dr. Anne Wolf, who is a fellow at All Souls College here at the University of Oxford. She is the author of the 2017 book, Political Islam in Tunisia, The History of the Nahda, which won the Choice Outstanding Academic title. And she's well on the way to a second book based on her PhD thesis, which is entitled Ben Ali's Tunisia, Power and Contention in an Authoritarian Regime, which is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. And so the title we're going to ask and put to both Youssef and Anne is The Political Crisis, the End of Democracy. Now, before I hand over to our speakers, I just want to say that both speakers will be speaking for about half an hour in total. We then will be turning over to questions and discussion. And if you would like to put a question to our speakers, you're very welcome to do so. If you'll see on the Q&A, the question and answer function on Zoom, if you click that, you can enter your question in the box there. And then we will go through that and pick out questions, and hopefully you'll get your question asked if we have time in the session. You're welcome to put your name down, or you're also very welcome to remain anonymous. Either way is fine by us. So do please put any questions you have to our speakers there, and we will discuss it in the second half of the webinar. So therefore, I'm very delighted to turn over to our first speaker, Youssef Cherif. Youssef.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hi, everyone. So I will start with a brief introduction, go through the socio-economic and political roots of the current crisis, expand on the situation of Tunisia today, and end with the international dimension of this crisis. So to start with, I would say that a decade of democratic transition left Tunisians unhappy about their country's economic and bureaucratic decline, or that's how many people perceived the last decade. They are extremely skeptical of the political and economic elite of the country and vocal about it. What I mean by vocal about it is that thanks to the freedoms gained in the last decade, Tunisians are allowed to express themselves openly and in the public sphere. So whatever problems there were, and there are many of them, they were amplified and debated by everyone. This doesn't mean that we should neglect the nature of the problems or the structural nature of the problem. So it's obvious that Tunisia's economic situation has deteriorated in the last 10 years. This has affected most citizens. The pandemic only worsened the issues. And in summer 2021, just a few months ago, a particularly violent COVID wave hit Tunisia, leaving thousands sick and dead. This is the background of President Kais Saied's July 25th power grab. And here is a short summary of where Tunisia is today. The president has monopolized most powers, parliament is suspended, and so are important articles of the constitution. A number of dubious arrests took place and military tribunals have become more active against civilians. The president happens to be the country's most popular politician and political entity. In fact, some think that he's more popular than all other politicians and political parties put together. So again, here, this nuance is important because with all what is happening, one has to recognize that he is extremely popular and that when he says that he has the popular legitimacy, he's not really like. Tunisia is under pressure by its traditional partners, the US, the UK, the EU, most G7 countries, and it is frequently urged to return to the democratic path. President Saied, however, seems to have a better reputation among the Saudis, the Emiratis, but not necessarily strong support, and I will come back to this. The Algerians, the French, and the Italians are also more willing to listen, to hear his views, but also without fully backing him neither. And most importantly, the country's economic problems haven't ended on July 25th, 2021. Now, day after day, idealism is being slowly replaced by reality. The president, who has all powers, needs to deliver, but he's facing a pile of issues. And from what we can see, discontent is mounting in the street. Now, I can go maybe later in the Q&A about some figures about the economic problems that explain the economic problems that the country is going through. And it's actually, if you take a graph between 2010 and 2021, you see a very clear decline on all aspects. So that actually explains why so many people feel unhappy about the last 10 years. Their economic situation really went down, and because of, again, of the freedoms of expression they gained, they can complain about it to each other and see actually the mess in which they are. And therefore, all Tunisians are aware of the big economic problem that the country is going through. And of course, the first ones to blame are the rulers, the elite, the political elite, the economic elite. And again, this is what happened. So there is also a feeling among the population that corruption is endemic and that corruption is spreading. This is, of course, this was the case before 2011, but it continued. And most Tunisians have the perception, at least, I don't know if that's true, but at least the perception is that corruption became much more widespread after the revolution, after 2011, than before. So consequently, we see a large section of the population for whom democracy is synonymous with state collapse. And by democracy, I mean the concepts parliament, political parties, political debates, constitution, etc. So think of the Tunisian constitution that, especially in the West, people praise as one of the most advanced constitutions in the region or even in the world. And so many conferences and so many stories were made about this constitution, and so many articles both academic and journalistic, then you go and ask Tunisians and they will tell you, no, this constitution is nonsense, this constitution is useless, and they will tell you about corruption, etc., etc. Again, here I'm talking not about all Tunisians, but a majority of Tunisians, and definitely not the supporters of Ennahda or of a few political parties, but a majority of Tunisians whom today we see them supporting President Kais Saied. So these are actually the citizens who celebrated the president's power grab and who tell you that whatever happens now and whatever happens in the future, it can't be worse than where the country was 3 months ago. They will tell you that. I'm not sure they will say the same thing in 3 or 6 months from now. Now, moving from the economic and social situation to the political situation, today we see, all of them are related, obviously. Today we see the army encircling the parliament and we see the president ruling by decrees. So we are tempted to describe the situation in black and white terms, democracy versus authoritarianism. But this is misleading because political parties in Tunisia represent only a few handfuls of partisans. Even Ennahda, that was seen as so powerful and so influential, proved actually very weak. When you look on July 25th, when the power grab happened, we haven't seen what we saw in Turkey, for instance, during the failed coup against Erdogan. We haven't seen Ennahda partisans in the streets calling for a return of the parliament and so on. We haven't seen Ennahda partisans protecting Ennahda's offices. So even Ennahda proved actually a much weaker political party than most observers thought. And the parliament is actually home to many MPs who are completely disconnected from their constituencies. The governments that ruled Tunisia in the last decade were mostly the results of informal negotiations that had little to do with the elections results. So just take the example of the last prime minister, Hisham el-Shishi. He disappeared for a few days after July 25th. And as far as I know, no one really looked for him, or there were no demonstrations calling for his return, not even a Facebook campaign asking for him to reappear. So the political parties and the economic interest groups that have controlled Tunisian politics during the last decade, they ignored the fact that election after election, year after year, the number of voters decreased and the number of those polled and claiming that they feel unrepresented by the political class continued to grow. And this is a reminder that the country was actually facing a major crisis of legitimacy, of political legitimacy on July 25th, when the president decided to act. Now, does it mean that the president has more legitimacy than those he toppled? Not necessarily. The president is extremely popular today, but that's because the ruling clique he toppled is widely hated. And also because Tunisia was suffering from the COVID pandemic this summer, as I mentioned earlier, until the vaccines came by the end of July and in August. So in the perception of many Tunisians, President Saied is seen as the one who brought the vaccines and who saved lives. But I think once the euphoria is over, once the economic realities of the country come to the fore, the president himself will have to confront the fact that he, like those he dismissed, doesn't have any real constituency and that his legitimacy may vanish in matter of days. So now going to Tunisia today, to legitimize his move, President Saied uses the populist narrative of speaking in the name of the people and acting for the people. And as I said, he's indeed very popular. So in the last 3 months, there were a number of actions that were taken with the umbrella of being taken in the name of the people. So a lot of dormant corruption cases were reopened. Several MPs, politicians, and businessmen face trial or are in jail. Actually, many of these trials were shelved or postponed in the last decade because of political settlements. And after a few weeks, for a few weeks after his power grab, There were travel bans imposed on many politicians and businessmen without further explanation. So it was somewhat arbitrary. But by the way, they were lifted since then. Foreign criticism is vehemently countered by the president and his supporters. So this is the atmosphere, actually. Just recently, there is a group called Tunisians Against the Coup. They wanted to set up a press conference, and then they were told that they cannot hold the press conference. These days, there is a garbage crisis in southern Tunisia and around Sfax. And the response of the president was to send in the police, which used tear gas. Actually, this was the first test of Kais Saied to face an angry mob, and he reacted just like his predecessors. There are a lot of troubles happening now in the country, and demonstrations are expected to continue and to increase over time. Whether Saied will continue to refuse dialogue and use the police each time there are demonstrations, we still don't know. Now, on a slightly more positive note, we see that there is a civilian government that was just appointed, so not a security government and not a government that responds to the political whims of this or that group. We see also that there are no bloodbaths in the country. I mean, again, compared with Egypt in 2013, you can't compare at all, barely. No immediate or very serious threat to the freedom of expression. For instance, the day after the power grab, Al Jazeera offices were raided, but Al Jazeera journalists are free to operate and broadcast live from Tunisia. The group Tunisians Against the Coup, who were not able to stage their press conference in a hall, they were able to do it in the street. And they actually got more publicity because they were in the street and cameras were filming and it was live on Facebook and so on. There are regular anti-Kais Saied demonstrations organized in the country. And the UGTT, the main labor union, has resumed its strikes and demonstrations without being harassed. So to answer the title of this webinar, I would say that democracy hasn't ended yet in Tunisia. And I will just finish with the international dimension. I think I only have maybe 2 minutes left. We can discuss this later, maybe in the Q&A. So I would say that while no Western government called Said's power grab coup or imposed sanctions, we see that Tunisia is under pressure to revert back to its democratic path. As I said, by the US, the EU, especially Germany, the IMF and World Bank, and most of the G7 countries are kind of worried about where Tunisia is going, and they are exerting pressure on the country. Saied is actually the president, and his circles are easily offended by the criticism coming from abroad. But again, another nuance here. He's very careful not to break Tunisia's ties with these foreign partners. So we haven't seen any ambassador being withdrawn, no embassies closed, no projects were cancelled, negotiations with the IMF continue. The appointed government is rather cosmopolitan. I mean, the ministers are rather cosmopolitan. We don't see radical nationalists or radical revolutionary, maybe some of them are, but the majority of them are more of cosmopolitan figures who lived abroad, who worked with international organizations and so on. So this is one part. Now, these are the angry ones. Now, the ones who are not very unhappy, we see that the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians keep praising President Saied on their media outlets. They sent several laudatory envoys to Tunisia in the days following the power grab. They have also sent important COVID aid and vaccines in July and August. And they actually, through that, they contributed in modeling the image of the savior that the president enjoys today. The Algerians, the French, and the Italians seem to also give Saied a pass. They barely issue any criticism. However, another nuance here, 3 months after or 4 months after the power grab, we haven't seen any one of these countries offering Tunisia the billions of dollars it needs to pass the winter. Their support is so far moral and not physical, if I can say, which means that actually Saied is not their guy. He is his own guy, a very stubborn nationalist leader with a very idealist mindset who is hard to co-opt. This leaves Tunisia in some no man's land. It's neither east nor west, but desperately in need of foreign support. It's neither a democracy nor an authoritarian regime, but it's somewhere in a gray zone. Until when can this last? This is an open question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Youssef, for a remarkably clear and concise treatment of what has happened over the last 4 months. And thank you particularly for adding the nuance. As you indicated, a lot of the coverage and discussion has fallen very clearly into one of two rather polarized positions, seeing it as something very good or something very damaging. And it's very good to hear that actually it's a much more mixed and much more nuanced picture. So thank you very much. Now turn to Anne. And pose the same question to you. Is it the end of democracy in Tunisia? Anne.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm afraid I'm a little bit more in it's more damaging camp, so a little bit more critical than Youssef, and I will explain in a minute why. Just going to start the presentation. So I'm going to focus my talk on Kais Saied, his rise and political project. And in specific, I'm going to focus on 3 main points. The first is Kais Saied's background and rise to power. Second, his political vision and strategies of power consolidation. And lastly, the challenges he faces and possible future scenarios. But first, I would like to start with a few quotes of him. And I'm not going to discuss them in much detail, but just wanted to put them out there, as I do think they convey quite well his political ambitions and ideas. First, in April, so even before what I will refer to as a coup, Kais Saied claimed, "I'm the commander of the security forces, not just of the army." However, according to the constitution, he is just the commander of the army, and the National Guard and the police are under the command of the prime minister. But Kais Saied did not accept this division of power. Then in June, so again before the coup, he talked about his plan to change the constitution and to install a presidential system. And he stated that there are those who will adhere to the new political system, as for those who will persist in their fallacious methods, be sure that they will end up in the dustbins of history. In his 25 July statement, when he announced he had taken over power and suspended parliament and the government, he threatened, "If anyone fires a single bullet against the security forces, they will respond by a rain of bullets." And a month later, he declared that the exceptional measures will be extended until the new order. And Kais Saied, of course, being the one deciding what the new order is and when it will be achieved. And I personally don't think there's any more much ambiguity about Kais Saied's intentions, namely that he wants to rule alone and that he doesn't accept any opposition to his rule. Indeed, he even threatens to use force against any challengers. And I would just like to briefly revisit Kais Saied's 2009 electoral campaign. So this slide, the picture you see is from 2019. And my main point here is that he never really hid his intentions to instigate deep changes to Tunisia's political institutions. And just a little bit of background for those of you who are not very familiar with Tunisian politics. In 2019, Kais Saied basically appeared out of nowhere. He's a professor in constitutional law and ran a grassroots campaign back then with almost no advertisement and no party apparatus behind him. His key message were youth empowerment, the fight against corruption, socioeconomic redistribution. And he portrayed himself as the people, as the president of the people, of the disenfranchised and the marginalized, especially young Tunisians. And the fact that he was not part of the political establishment and hardly spent any money at all on campaigning was seen as evidence that he's trustworthy, clean, and honest. very different from how the political elite at that time was seen by the people. And the main controversies back then were really about his conservative positions on a number of issues, such as women's rights. He spoke out against equality in inheritance, homosexuality, which he wanted to criminalize, as well as his support of the death penalty. But interestingly, his positions on Tunisia's political system did not draw as much attention back then at all. And this was despite the fact that he openly said that he would like to change the constitution, introduce a political system, and change the electoral laws. However, these ideas were back then commonly portrayed in a way as the idealist or the utopian beliefs of a professor. And I think this image still today very much prevails among some sectors in Tunisia. And I did find a testimony of one of his former students in 2019, which you can see on the bottom right corner of the slide. I found it actually very interesting. The student described Kais Saied in 2019 as a man haunted by an idea, who has some reservations about representative democracy as it is practiced and experienced in Tunisia. And I did find the adjective of haunted very powerful, because it does convey the extent to which political change has been central to him for a very long time. It's almost as if the student wants to tell us he has been obsessed by it. And really what has characterized Kais Saied ever since he took power was his complete unwillingness to compromise on his political vision. Indeed, an unwillingness to engage with any other political tendencies on anything at all, or to even engage with them in any meaningful or constructive way. And I think what we saw on the 25th of July, when he suspended parliament and the government, is in a way the culmination of this tendency of no compromise and engagement with other political tendencies. So now fast forward, Kais Saied since 25th of July. On the top left, you see him surrounded by top security officials as he announced that he has suspended parliament and the government. On the top right, you can see him during a speech to the public while he holds up some posters or featuring scenes of disturbance and quarrels in parliament. And he uses that to show to what extent MPs are instigators of violence, according to him, and basically to justify him shutting parliament down and referring to it as useless and not representative of the people. On the bottom left, you can see pro-Kais Saied protesters, and the picture on the bottom right I find particularly interesting. You can see Kais Saied behind and with the new Prime Minister, Najla Boudin. And I find the symbolism of this picture actually very powerful and interesting. Kais Saied behind his beautiful desk, looking very much presidential-like, and the Prime Minister sitting in front of him, looking up on a simple chair, almost as if she was a student looking at a professor waiting for instructions and guidance. And I do think that reflects the dynamics between the two of them very well. As Youssef mentioned, Kais Saied remains extremely popular with the people, and his power grab was initially welcomed by many political actors. Indeed, according to the latest polls, which I just checked before, about 80% of the people are still satisfied with him today. And that's really, really massive and important. And this is also due to what can be referred to as populist strategy of power consolidation. Kais Saied portrays himself as the leader of Tunisia's revolution. He says that the previous political leaders hijacked the revolution, and he wants to finally do justice to people's revolutionary demands. He denounces political parties, says they are corrupt, and he vouches to introduce an element of local democracy that gives power back to the people. Supposedly, of course, I don't think what we're seeing here right now is really going into the democratic direction. And Kais Saied really positions himself as the spokesman of the people, the only one who knows what the people want. The way he thinks he is the one who can read and realize people's demands. So when people ask him what his political project is, he commonly replies, "I want what the people want." If he's being asked a follow-up question, what do the people want? He says, the people know what they want. So not very useful. He also plays on people's nationalist sentiments and commonly denounces foreign interference, as Youssef has mentioned as well. And of course, this nationalism or revolutionary populism are common strategies of domination among wannabe dictators or strongmen, especially those who take power amid wider political and economic crisis and promise to correct past wrongs. So it's really not that exceptional in this respect. And I think Kais Saied also employs another common strategy of power consolidation, which is the instigation of confusion and general vagueness about what comes next. Some people often say that, Kais Saied might not know himself what he wants and what's next, but I think he has shown very clearly over the past weeks, months, indeed even years, that he knows what he wants. He has always envisioned a strong presidency, and he should not be underestimated because of that. And he's deliberately instigating to some extent a confusion about his project because it buys him time. And when people are confused, they are also not organizing as forcefully against him because they still have hope that something positive will come out of this crisis. And even now, as he's facing increasing opposition from the political class, even from some civil society groups, many key actors are still waiting for something to happen. They're hoping that this will end in the way they want. But Kais Saied has been using this time to place many of his allies in strategic positions, to pursue structural changes, nominating a prime minister and a government that he largely controls, as well as imprisoning some opposition figures. So the question is really, what is his plan? What kind of regime does he want? And what kind of regime is he trying to construct? And obviously, it's too early to be sure, and the next weeks and months will be pivotal in that respect. But I do think he has some kind of what we call hybrid or competitive authoritarian regime in mind. So an autocratic system that retains some democratic features, but that does not pose any real challenge to the leaders, so to himself. So this could, for example, consist of introducing some kind of local democratic elections, even presidential elections, which he would obviously be certain to win at this stage, given the massive popular support he has. The real question really is, will Kais Saied succeed in his project? And I've heard a lot of comparisons between Egypt and Tunisia over the past weeks and months. And there are some obvious parallels in the sense that in both countries, the coups that happened after the Arab uprising had the backing of the army and of a range of anti-democratic and anti-Islamist forces. But I also do think, like Youssef also mentioned, that the comparison in many ways is limited. The main political actors in Tunisia and Egypt are very different. The power balance is different, and the main political stakeholders are very distinct. However, I do think that a comparison between Kais Saied and Ben Ali, when Ben Ali took power, is quite insightful, as it can reveal some of the main challenges that lie ahead for Kais Saied. Just some background here. In 1987, Ben Ali also conducted what back then was similarly termed a constitutional coup that was supported by the army. And Ben Ali back then was also a relative political newcomer. And he took power during a time of wider political and economic crisis, so though obviously not as acute as it was in Tunisia this summer. And similar to Kais Saied, Ben Ali employed a rhetoric of wanting to correct past political and economic wrongs. And the main difference between the two of them is really that Kais Saied obviously is very popular, and Ben Ali has a military background, which is very significant. However, how did Ben Ali consolidate power? What did he do? He employed a very different approach. He gathered a very broad support coalition that included all main political actors, the UGTT, which is the workers' union, the ruling PSD party, secular opposition parties, even representative of the Islamist movement. So Ben Ali decided to reach out to all of them. And once he had gathered and accumulated enough power in the space of 2 years, he began to slowly crack down on his main challenges. And from comparative research on authoritarian politics, we know that such broad coalitions are most conducive to power consolidation of strongmen or wannabe dictators. However, Kais Saied is very different in that respect. Kais Saied is vilifying, indeed slandering, all major political parties and national organizations, calling them, for example, drunken and denouncing them as corrupt and liars. Even those that initially supported him. And as a result, he's becoming increasingly politically isolated. And this will be a major challenge, especially in the medium and long term. I'm not aware of any main political party or national organization still supporting him. And Kais Saied will not be able to uphold his popular support base forever in part of this political isolation. Also, he acknowledges himself that he's not good with numbers and the economy. He does not have a magic solution to solve Tunisia's economic problems. And if anything, the current political crisis will just make them much worse. And this, in turn, does make his political future very much dependent on the support he receives from the army. And to conclude, I would like to outline the 3 main scenarios for the future. The most optimistic one, and the one I believe Youssef hopes will happen, is that domestic and international pressure will increase and gradually force Kais Saied to agree to some kind of roadmap with all key political actors. And so a solution to the crisis will be found. However, I have to say that at this point in time, he has categorically refused such a path. The second one is that he will consolidate more and more power, and we will see more and more restrictions on political freedoms, especially as his popularity will gradually fade. Basically, he will join the ranks of populist dictators around the world. And judging from the picture on the slide, which has been circulating on social media, that's what some Tunisians seem to believe is happening. And in a third scenario, the army takes over. This could happen, for example, if major violence erupts between Kais Saied's supporters and the opposition, or simply the economic crisis will worsen. So we see many more instances of social unrest and demonstrations, as is happening in Sfax, for example, at the moment. So officers might decide to step in this scenario, even if just for a transitional period. So as you can see, a little bit more bleak, my presentation and my talk compared to Youssef's, and I will leave it here for now. But I look very much forward to discussing with all of you during the Q&A.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. Kais Saied has been a bit of a mystery figure, I think, even since he was elected, and you've gone some way to trying to demystify who he is and what he's about. So thank you very much. We now move on to looking at questions and answers, and I would encourage you again to use the question and answer function if you want to pose a question to either our speakers or a more general question to both speakers. So I do encourage you to do that. So that's in the Q&A. If you just click on the Q&A function, you can then type in your question. I would like to begin with a question I have for both speakers. And it comes back to something that was a quote from Anne that Kais Saied said. And he said he seems to have reservations about representative democracy as it's practiced in Tunisia. Now, it seems to me that this reservation is substantially shared with a large part of the Tunisian population. They both have reservations about representative democracy as it's practiced in Tunisia. And my question is really to focus on that last emphasis. Is it a reservation about representative democracy in the way it's been practiced and introduced in Tunisia over the last 10 years? Or is it actually a more profound reservation they share about representative democracy as a way of running Tunisia? In other words, it's not just the way it's been done, it's just the general principle. And if so, what sort of ways out of this? Kais Saied has a view of what could replace this more traditional form of representative democracy. So perhaps go first to Youssef on that. Youssef.
So the issue here is that no one is actually giving an alternative. Yes, he has reservations. Many people have reservations. But then ask them, what do you suggest? What you hear usually is, oh, we need a presidential system because that's how Tunisia was ruled for most of its post-colonial era, and many consider that it works. But then is there something like a very clear guidebook on where we're going and how we should go there? No, even President Saied himself, he doesn't. If you look for his program during the elections, you have some speeches, but you don't have something concrete. This is not, so the plan that many people are talking about today doesn't exist actually. It's being put in place now, probably by some groups around him, but it's not there yet. While the parliamentary or semi-parliamentary system that we had until July 25th is something that a lot of experts sat together and put in place, and so that's how it was created. So it's not something that was imposed, like many people who are critical of the period before July 25th say. So my fear here, when many Tunisians say that they want another political system, my fear is that, one, there is nothing clear, concrete. So the thing that they're heading to, or that the country is heading to, is what Anne described, something of a more maybe hybrid democracy or hybrid authoritarian system, but actually it's something that is less democratic than where we were. And as we know from many examples in the world, you can take any dictatorship, call it a democracy, and move on, but actually it's a dictatorship. I mean, China or North Korea or even Russia, they call themselves democracy, and the concept of sovereign democracy in Russia. So would we have something similar in Tunisia and then presented as a democracy? That's a risk. And I agree with many points that Anne said, but for other reasons that are, the balance of power in the country, I still think that we're not going there yet. And I still think that 4 months after the power grab, we don't have an alternative. And so, there needs to be a solution, and I think the solution needs to be negotiated.
Thank you, Youssef. Anne?
If I could just jump in. I think one of the key problems here is really that we have seen over the past years, really already, I remember in 2013, I think it really started in Tunisia, that I was struck by the growing skepticism against political parties by the people, and skepticism that has been amplified by the media, that has been focusing on the quarrels between the politicians. So the concept of political parties as mediator of the will of the people has become extremely questioned, and Kais Saied has really been feeding into this, to the skepticism and almost like hatred of political parties and politicians who are increasingly associated with just their own interest. And already in 2013-14, I remember people talking that they wished the army would take over, which back then, where a lot of people in Western universities were still celebrating the Tunisian experiment. So this really very much clashed with the perception of the Tunisian model that we were celebrating here, this growing skepticism of the political system that we have in Tunisia, and calls for an alternative, increasing talk about a third way, something in between the political system that we're having and a strong dictator. And that, again, I think Kais Saied is exploiting by trying to introduce some kind of hybrid or competitive authoritarian system.
Thank you very much, Anne. Moving now to the questions that are coming in on the Q&A bar. Thank you very much for typing in your questions. We've got a lot of very distinguished and knowledgeable people on North Africa who follow it and follow Tunisia very well. So we're delighted to have them join us. And the first of those is the Heba Salah, who, as many of you will know, has been writing on North Africa in the British national press for many years. Welcome, Heba, and thank you very much for joining us. And Heba's question is, was the situation before July the 25th in Tunisia sustainable, and did it have the ability to self-correct? And I think Heba, if I want to rephrase Heba's question, is saying, really, was it unavoidable that something had to happen, that a crisis had come to power, or did Kais Saied's intervention actually really interfere in something that could have actually self-corrected? Again, go first to Youssef first.
This is an easy and difficult question. And actually, I looked back at some articles I wrote or some comments I made before July 25th. At some point, I would say, well, this is not a sustainable situation and it will explode. And at some point, I say, well, this is how democracy works, and this status quo will stay forever. But what is sure is that there was a crisis before July 25th. Everyone was unhappy that the president would decide something, the prime minister would decide something against it, the parliament would vote something, and the president would say no. So there was a blockage, and well, now a lot of people in each side puts the responsibility on the other, but there was a blockage. So I think I think something needed to happen, but something more early elections rather than this. But this is what happened, and I think what happened is actually the pessimistic scenario and not the natural scenario, which was early election.
Anne.
Yeah, I agree with Youssef that obviously there was a major crisis, which wasn't just about a health crisis, the economic crisis. There was a political crisis between the president, the prime minister, and the head of parliament. And on top of that, there was another major crisis, which we haven't actually talked about yet, which was a crisis within the largest political party in Tunisia, within Ennahda, which has, to some extent, has served as a counterbalance or as a balancing force ever since the Tunisian uprisings. Ennahda has always been there. All other parties there have been a lot of parties being created. A lot of them have collapsed, but Ennahda in a way was a stabilizing factor. And this wasn't so much the case anymore this summer for a variety of reasons. The reasons, one of them is that the head of Ennahda, Ghannouchi, took the leadership of the parliament, but he's a very controversial figure. One of the most distrusted person in Tunisia. So he amplified a political crisis. At the same time, the crisis was also internal within Ennahda, because Ghannouchi was trying to accumulate more power within the party, didn't want to cede the leadership of the party, even though the party charter told him to do so. So as a result, Ennahda was gradually imploding from the inside. There were a lot of statements, criticism between rival factions to an extent Ennahda has never seen before in its entire history. It is still the biggest crisis Ennahda has ever seen. The one force that has, in a way, stabilized the political transformation in Tunisia over the past decade, even though it has been very much criticized. Sometimes rightfully, sometimes not rightfully. And I think the crisis of Tunisia today, at least to some extent, is also reflective of the crisis within Ennahda.
Thank you very much, Anne. And thank you for saying something about Ennahda. Again, it hadn't been referred to much in your original presentations, and they're obviously a crucial part of this jigsaw, and that helps explain things very nicely. For our next question, we go to somebody else who follows and knows Tunisia very well. Danny Zissenwine. Welcome, Danny. Very nice to have you join us. And Danny's question is about the army. How influential, powerful is the Tunisian army today? Unlike Egypt, the army in Tunisia was always marginal to political life. And indeed, that was one of the explanations for why the revolution succeeded in Tunisia, often said. And could the army really be able and interested to intervene? And you referred to the army, perhaps go to you first to mention about whether we will see the army in Tunisia, which has really not played a political role throughout post-independence history in quite a remarkable way, whether that might change.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, indeed one of the key questions right now. And I'm not sure I have one very obvious answer to this. That would be very easy, but I don't. But just to put maybe the role of the army or demystify a little bit, I think it has the degree of neutrality and apolitical position of the Tunisian army. I do think it has been overstated. It has also been overstated that the army is very weak in other countries, with an army comparable or as like a army force comparable to the size of Tunisia. Military coups have happened. So it's not that, Tunisia's army is this weak, marginalized force. That's the first point I want to make. And the other point that I want to make is that how the army has been misportrayed also during the Tunisian revolution, when the narrative circulated that the army defected from Ben Ali and in a way sided with the Tunisian people, which it's been quoted dozens and dozens of times, but is unfortunately not what happened. What actually happened back then is that the army did not do anything because Ben Ali, at least not until Ben Ali left, because Ben Ali had never asked the army. There were contacts and the officers asked him what to do. So in a way, the army was following Ben Ali, but until the end, but basically following what he had asked him to do, which is not much at that time. So where does that leave us? Basically, the army is a very disciplined organization. They like hierarchy. Many of the officers were appointed by Ben Ali, rose through Ben Ali. A lot of them are highly skeptical of Islamists, which everyone knows who has already talked to some of them. I think already in 2013, with the events in Egypt, some of them, at least privately, liked the idea, if I may say that something similar would happen in Tunisia. So we don't know what's going to happen in the future. I'm not saying the army, there's going to be suddenly a military dictatorship. I think that would be way too far-fetched. But I do think they had a choice when Kais Saied invoked Article 80, which, if you read the article, you don't need to be an expert of constitutional law like he is. You just need to be a simple person like we are. Read the article, and you can see it's not constitutional because the parliament, it says very clearly, the parliament should be in session. What the army did, they actually blocked people from entering the parliament. And so basically they decided to follow the orders of Kais Saied, even though he was not working anymore in a legal frame. And I do think by that, their political neutrality collapsed. They agreed to follow orders of someone who did not operate anymore within a constitutional frame. So I don't think we can describe the army at this point as neutral, or as they've clearly taken sides. The question is just what they will do in the future, and this I cannot answer.
Thank you, Anne. Youssef, your view. No, I agree with Anne that the army is not that neutral in Tunisia, like any country. I mean, by the end of the day, it's part of the political spectrum. But one thing is that even when they went to parliament, etc., one thing with the Tunisian army is that they rarely confront citizens. So even on July 25th, they were sitting there. They would tell people not to enter, but they would not shoot on people. For the future, well, the army is an option, but also in a place like Tunisia, where the police and the Ministry of Interior are actually very influential. And for decades, they were the ones actually pulling the strings more than the army itself. They are another important player that can want to take up more powers. But I think the army today is more powerful than where it was 10 years ago. And so its place is actually perhaps as important, a little bit more important than the Ministry of Interior. So there is a balance of power there. And also, I think be it the army or the police, they don't see themselves as being able to control the whole country for a long period of time. And so far, I don't see them really moving in and taking power. But as Anne said, I mean, this is an open question.
Thank you, Youssef. This question is again dealing with significant actors outside of a formal political realm, and it deals with, and this comes from anonymously, which is absolutely fine, and it deals with the UGTT, which is the main trade union federation. As many of you know Tunisia well, Tunisia has an extremely powerful trade union movement, probably the most powerful in the Arab world, but did play a significant role in the revolution. And the question is, what do you think the role of the UGTT will be in the next weeks or months? Both of you have already replied, made some reference to this. Do they have the ability to slow or even stop Kais Saied's ascension? So on the role of the UGTT. Anne, perhaps you'd like to go first on that.
Yes, sure. So maybe let's start by the position of the UGTT on what has happened. At the beginning, like many other organizations and political parties as well, they actually, maybe I should start by clarifying there's not one UGTT, it's a massive organization, obviously, with many different factions. And so the position right now, what I'm first referring to is the official position as discussed by the President Tebboune. So at the beginning, the UGT was very favorable, and Tebboune was even trying to reach out to Kais Saied, because what the UGTT wanted is some kind of a real influence on taking a major role within this political crisis and drafting some kind of roadmap on how to get out of it. So they initially declared they supported him. Then they even themselves drafted a roadmap of how they envisioned to get out of the crisis in a very detailed way, similar to they envisioned a similar process that they had together with the quartet. But even now, Kais Saied did not engage with this. So he's very, in that sense, I think, not very strategic, in the sense that even the forces, be they political parties or national organizations, that strongly spoke out in favor of him at the beginning, he is not reacting to them and trying to integrate them in any way in this political limbo that he actually created. So what we're seeing now is the UGTT becoming more and more critical of him, many people speaking out, calling this a coup, and being afraid also that we will turn to the times like they were under Ben Ali. I mean, no one actually really knows Kais Saied, and that makes him extremely unpredictable. And I think all the major national organizations and political parties are realizing that. They place this hope in this idealist utopian professor and are still hoping that he's an idealist as opposed to a dictator. But I think they're increasingly realizing they're actually having to deal with an idealist dictator, which is not a contradiction in terms.
Thank you, Anne. Youssef.
Yeah, actually, on UGTT, I think the main reason why they supported Kais Saied on July 25th is because their grassroots are supportive of him. Their grassroots, many of them are very much opposed to Ennahda. Most of them work in the public sector, so they have been there since the Ben Ali era, so they still believe that what Tunisia needs is a strong man and not a parliament, and so on and so on. So the grassroots, and also because of his very anti-imperialistic narrative and discourse, so he seduced them. Now, the UGTT had to follow that wave, the leadership of UGTT, but slowly they started criticizing him as weeks went by. Because actually the leadership of UGTT feels that Kais Saied doesn't necessarily want to deal with them, as Anne said. He alienated almost everyone, and he considers himself as the the embodiment of everything right and of cleanness, etc. And so he probably considers some UGTT leaders as corrupt. So UGTT actually, the leadership of UGTT found itself sidelined by him and possibly accused by him of or people around him of corruption. So they are afraid of what will happen if he continues like this. They are afraid also that if he continues monopolizing power, they won't be able to negotiate with the government as they used to do before to get higher wages and better salaries and better conditions for their members who work in the public sector. So they are worried about what will happen to them. But now that they see that his popularity may be decreasing, not that much, but some people start questioning what he's doing. You see them more and more critical. You see more and more strikes organized by UGTT, very limited, very small, but it's growing in number. And I think we spoke about the army or the police, but I think UGTT is the other big player, much more important than any political party. And much more, I mean, it has actually a much more solid basis than any political party, even though it's not a political party. So in the future, I think we'll see we'll see UGTT more and more vocal against Kais Saied, and the less popular he is, the more UGTT will speak up. And once the economic crisis that most people expect gets deeper, I think UGTT will have a much important role to play in the country and to oblige him to negotiate, or we will see some kind of bras de fer between UGTT and the president and whoever is around.
Thank you, Youssef. We have time for one more question. Apologies to all of the wonderful questions, great question people have put in. It'd be nice to extend this session. We have time for one more question. The last question comes from one of the master's students here at the Middle East Centre, Riley Sanborn. And Riley's question is, prior to the events of July, the expressly anti-democratic and authoritarian nostalgic Parti d'Historien Libre, the Free Historian Party, led the opinion polls in a hypothetical next election. What does this say about the attitudes of the Tunisian public leading into the current crisis? Does popular support for such a party that was nostalgic about the past reflect growing anti-revolutionary sentiments, or is this more a product of popular anti-elite attitudes? Anne first.
Okay, a very long question, but so basically, if I understood correctly, it's about what the rise of Abir Moussi has to say about the current situation. Sorry, that's probably not doing justice to the question, but yeah, I think, and whether or not it was anti-revolutionary elite. Sorry, I might have missed the past, but I think, I mean, the rise of Abir Moussi is has in a way foreshadowed. I mean, it's easy to say in retrospect, but it has been foreshadowing this anti-revolutionary movement that we're now witnessing, I think, for a very long time. I mean, Abir Moussi has been embodying in a way, or try to unite different factions, anti-revolutionary factions, though not all of them would describe themselves as anti-revolutionary. That's also important to notice. So she is looking, or she's trying to unite, has long united, for example, members of the former ruling party of Ben Ali, the RCD, but also other forces, especially anti-Islamist forces. And so yeah, I mean, these are also the people who many of them are now backing Kais Saied. So I think there's a little bit of a continuity in this respect. And the question is now just what is actually going to happen with Abir Moussi and her party. And I think it's quite interesting how she reacted, and Youssef can maybe tell us more about that, how this is being played out on the ground. But the way I've been seeing it is that actually at the beginning she took a long time to react, because in a way Kais Saied reflects many of the or or reflects many of the projects that she has been striving to achieve herself in Tunisia. So ideologically, they're very much close, but politically they are competitors. So put her in a very difficult situation, because she could not now suddenly say she's not supporting Kais Saied, because she has been saying for a long time she would like that the Islamists disappear, and has been using a lot of extremely violent anti-Islamist rhetoric. So what we saw after he took power, that actually she waited for a long time. A lot of other political parties, they already published statements. She waited some time. She clearly needed some time to think about how to approach this very difficult political dilemma. And then she spoke out in support of him, also expressing the hope that finally the Muslim Brotherhood, as she derogatively calls Ennahda, in that she means it derogatively. I'm not saying that I find it derogatively, but Ennahda does not identify the leadership as the Muslim Brotherhood. So she in a way tried to celebrate it as a way against the Islamist establishment in Tunisia. But now, fast forward a few months later, she, like many other people, are also speaking out of Kais Saied, because in the political future that Kais Saied is trying to draw here, there's also no room for Abir Moussi and her followership. There's just room for Kais Saied and the people, and everyone else in between is disappearing. And that poses a problem for all political parties, all tendencies, no matter how close to Kais Saied. And that leaves him increasingly isolated and vulnerable, as I also outlined in my talk.
Thank you, Anne. Youssef.
So I think the main reason why a lot of people supported Abir Moussi and the Parti d'Historien Libre before July 25th, and why many people support Kais Saied, is not because of their anti-Islamism or because of their anti-democracy perspectives, but because they came against Ennahda. For many Tunisians, at least if we take those who are supportive of the Parti d'Historien Libre, plus those who are supportive of Kais Saied, we can call them a majority of Tunisians. Ennahda represents the last 10 years, represent the ruling power of the last 10 years. So in a way, and Anne mentioned earlier the fact that Ennahda was criticized for right or for wrong. Many times there are a lot of fake news against Ennahda, but actually for a majority of Tunisians, Ennahda is representative of those 10 years, representative of the state collapse, of the economic problems, corruption, etc., etc. And so whoever comes and opposes Ennahda, they would come with him or with her. And this is actually what happened 10 years ago. I mean, the reason why many people went out against Ben Ali and vote and picked people who are opposed to Ben Ali is because they simply represented something else and different from Ben Ali. So it would be wrong to describe this as pro-democracy, anti-democracy, pro-revolution, anti-revolution. I mean, frankly, Ennahda, especially in recent years, they had alliances with people who would represent the elite of the Ben Ali regime and the people who are known to be corrupt. And so Ennahda is not anymore that revolutionary party or that, and not also that classical Islamist party, but it became an opportunist party, like all political parties actually. And so, as I said, I mean, for many people, it does embody the last 10 years, the failures of the last 10 years. And then people went for Kais Saied and the Parti d'Historien Libre. The reason maybe why before July 25th is that people did not really see something like what happened in July 25th. So the only option they saw out of Ennahda was to go in for elections and vote for something else. And the something else was the Parti d'Historien Libre. Now that Saied did his power grab and that democracy is on standby and that people don't know when the next elections will take place, many people who were supportive of Parti d'Historien Libre are now supportive of Kais Saied. But again, this is happening now. It's been 4 months, but in 6 months from now, I think we'll see a completely different picture. And now that Kais Saied is the one who's in charge of everything, people will blame him for everything, because I don't think the socioeconomic situation will improve in the upcoming months, we will see people criticizing him and opposing him in a few months from now, or a few years from now, but not so long, the way they are now opposing Ennahda and the way they opposed Ben Ali 10 years ago.
Thank you, Youssef. Thank you. I'm afraid the clock is against us, which means we must draw the session to a close. And I apologize again for all the people who posed questions who weren't able to post them. We would like to have gone through all of them. But thank you very much for joining us. And I want to thank our two speakers this evening, Youssef and Anne. I had found a very confusing situation of what had happened since July. And I feel, even though I don't quite understand everything yet, I feel a lot better equipped to try and understand what is happening in Tunisia and to see how things unfold from here. So thank you very much to both of you. And thank you to all of you attending. And I look forward to you joining us on another occasion. Thank you very much and have a very nice evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.